This week on Quadriga, Bundeswehr missions. Is the military ready? Training the Kurds in northern Iraq. Deliveries of aid to Ebola-stricken West Africa. Just two examples of Germany's armed forces being sent to crisis zones around the world. But a government-commissioned report published this week says they do not have the equipment they need. Large procurement projects are being delivered years late, and often millions of euros over budget. The result? The Bundeswehr has to rely on old equipment, which needs frequent maintenance and often cannot be used at all. Why is Germany's military not fully operational? And can it fulfill its NATO obligations? Your host this week, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to a new edition of Quadriga. Well, you've just heard the question, is Germany's military operational and ready? That is the question we want to get to the bottom of on today's show. And of course, with all the crises going on right now in the world, it is a very vital question. And to answer that, I have invited three experts today, all who've been following the story very closely. Very welcome to Johannes Leithäuser, who is a Berlin correspondent for the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. He's been with the newspaper since 1988 and served previously as the paper's London correspondent. Also a very warm welcome to Judy Dempsey, who is senior associate at Carnegie Europe and the editor-in-chief of the blog Strategic Europe. Previously, she reported for the International Herald Tribune, the Economist, and the Financial Times. And last but not least, Alison Smale, who heads the New York Times bureau here in Berlin. As deputy foreign editor at the New York Times, she organized much of the paper's coverage of the Iraq War. And of course, she was also formerly executive editor at the Herald Tribune. Very warm welcome to you all. Johannes Leithäuser, let's get right to it. A leaked parliamentary report detailed the rather dismal state of the German's military hardware. Now, you've covered German politics for a very long time, including the military. Did this report surprise you?
Not in the least. I think it didn't even surprise the defense minister, Mrs. von der Leyen, because when she presented it in the end, she said, you could say it's all same old, same old. We've heard many of these things before. And it's all about the new weapons and technology the German military has been waiting for many, many years now. And as your film said just now, it is because we have to use the old stuff so many years longer that there are frequent breakdowns and things occurring that shouldn't happen.
So no surprise, says Johannes Leithäuser. Judy, what about you?
Well, I was surprised that it was published, actually. Although von der Leyen, the Minister of Defense, she wanted to do this for two reasons: that she's inherited a complete mess in the German armed forces. There's been talk about reform. Yes, they got rid of conscription, but that wasn't accompanied by fundamental structural reforms, weapons procurement, training, modernising the entire armed forces. So in that sense, it was very clever of her to commission an independent report to finally explain to the German public and make accessible what is our army for.
And indeed, the German military is not so much in the headlines. This is one of the rare occasions where we actually talk about it, not just on the show, but also in the papers and the articles. If that you are right, Alison Smale, you've written an article about the rather dismal state of Germany's military hardware. Now, as a non-German, yes, who is covering Germany, though, is that something that took you by surprise?
Well, no, because I have actually followed German affairs for a long time, and I think it's been obvious to everybody that the Bundeswehr has never had the sort of priority in this society, for understandable reasons, that it has, say, that armed forces have in, say, Britain or France. So there's a difficulty of commanding resources, of commanding attention. But what's happening now, it's not so much that the state of the military is new, the context is new. We are in the middle of several crises. Germany is in the middle of a debate about how much to sort of step up its presence on the international stage. And these two things have therefore come together. And I think Judy is absolutely right that von der Leyen wanted to surface all of this, presumably with the backing of the Chancellor, so that they could start to finally tackle, because if you are going to have a more active role on the international stage, you've got to have the tools
And before we get into much more detail about what to do with this report and the consequences, let's have a quick look at what the report actually has found out. Let's have a quick look.
The first Airbus A400M transport plane is expected to be ready next month, 5 years behind schedule. But the plane it is meant to replace, the C-160 Transall, has been in service for 50 years and is no longer reliable. Problems with the aircraft recently caused an embarrassing delay in a transport of weapons from Germany to the Kurds in northern Iraq. With the Puma tank, it's the same story. Technical problems, late delivery, and the price tag keeps on rising. Meanwhile, much of the Bundeswehr's existing equipment is not usable at all. Less than a third of its Tiger combat helicopters are operational. And out of 109 Eurofighter aircraft, only 42 are ready for action.
Well, Johannes, this report cannot please you, cannot please anyone. Only a fraction of Germany's helicopters, submarines, and tanks are fit to be deployed. This is what the report says. You still say you're not surprised, you say, but are you at least...
It's not satisfactory, that's clear. If you go into these details, which we don't want to do too much, you will find different reasons for any kind of weapon, why it's not ready.
Give us one.
For instance, the helicopters were first conceived in the ending days of the Cold War, when they were meant to attack Russian tanks coming over the northern German plains. Then they have been ordered in the 19th, so that's 20 years back. Things have developed since, so the military always came back to the planners and said, look, we have to change things. The planners changed things. The helicopters were not ready then. Then we got this huge mission.
So what are you saying? The German military cannot keep up to date with technology?
No, the German military is trying to keep up to date, but the industry then has to deliver again and to make new plans, and that takes time. So I think takes two to tango here as well. There's the industry on one side and the military on the other. And what happened in the end, we had this long-lasting mission in Afghanistan, and they brought these helicopters in there at the very end. And for that, they had to be changed again. So they started to kind of cannibalize. They had got 20 by then, and to fit out 8 of them properly, they ripped the others of spare parts and sent them to Afghanistan to make them work there. So that's what you end up with when you change things too often. And I think that's one of the conclusions of this report. We have to get rid of standards somehow to make things work quicker.
I think that's a very interesting point. Germany is no exception. There's always ambiguities between industry, the military industry complex, and the armed forces. You see this in France, you see this particularly in the United States and in Great Britain. And always a conflict, who to buy from, the kind of lobbies and so on. So maybe there's just never sufficient transparency. And so von der Leyen wants to deal with this. The other aspect, which in defense of the defense ministry, is that the enormous wear and tear of equipment in the war in Afghanistan. Helicopters were used for 3 months, full of dust, had to go back. And so the maintenance charges were huge on the one hand, and on the other hand, the German Bundeswehr, the soldiers in Afghanistan, the German soldiers complained they weren't getting enough decent equipment, enough protection, enough literally equipment to look after them. And so what was happened, money was diverted from the budget to give them extra protection. And what happened? Not enough money for spare parts.
But this worked, by the way. I mean, all the things they needed in their combat mission, they got very quickly.
Absolutely.
So
it can be done.
It's a split picture.
But it's basically, I really do come back to this question of context. And the fact is that there's still a reluctance in this society to deploy German force in any way, or to think of that as one of the kind of equal tools of diplomacy and foreign policy.
So you say there's a relation between public opinion and the dismal state of the German Bundeswehr?
In a very indirect way. I mean, I'm not saying, oh, well, Germans don't think enough about it, so therefore they don't have. But it's instructive that the defense ministry in this, I think in the Bundesrepublik, there have been 17 defense ministers. There have been far fewer chancellors. only one of the defense ministers, Helmut Schmidt, has ever gone on to become chancellor. This is not an easy job in German politics. And von der Leyen seems to have some backing from the chancellery to really try to sort it out. She has a reputation as being brisk and businesslike. She's obviously trying to use that reputation.
And she's ambitious.
And absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was quite interesting to watch her performance in Parliament yesterday, I thought, because it was actually pretty low-key. It was just very matter of fact. The chamber was not very full at all.
Yeah.
There were far more school pupils and others in the gallery than there were actual deputies there for the debate.
Let's pick up on the standing of the German Bundeswehr in German society. Johannes, you think that the cuts and underinvestment that the German military has had to endure over the decades...
Yeah, I think Alison is absolutely right. If you look at recent polls, should we go and help the fight against IS in Iraq or Syria, you'll find a majority saying, well, maybe not. And I think it's a big task for politicians in Germany to make aware the international responsibility this country has got. This debate has started a year ago and not started for the first time. We have done this 10 years ago as well when we went...
30 years ago.
Sorry.
Yeah, Judy, I mean, this report could not have come at a worse time because this is the year where leading German politicians, including Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen, has declared that Germany is ready and willing to play a greater role in world affairs.
Well, that's why it's come at the best time, probably, actually to underpin this, because as Alison said, you can't, I mean, it's a real catchphrase now, Germany must assume greater responsibility, but, you know, really, what does this mean? Responsibility for humanitarian affairs, for delivering weapons, and Germany does an awful lot of this, but also to be seriously involved in crisis management and conflicts. So you have to have the hard tools and the soft power tools to underpin what is emerging as a new intellectual philosophical discussion about Germany's responsibilities. By the way, this started in 1999 when the Red-Green coalition was in and when you had your first Green Foreign Minister, Joschka Fischer. He started the debate, and that was completely snuffed out when the left-right coalition came in 2005. So essentially we're back to 1999, the role of Germany as a security provider.
But this year, Alison, President Gauck, Ursula von der Leyen, Foreign Minister Steinmeier, they've all made a point that Germany is ready and willing to play its part. Is there a discrepancy between ambition and capability here?
Well, I mean, I think there's a discrepancy perhaps between ambition and popular will, and obviously to some extent all these difficulties do mount up and illustrate perhaps we need a sort of greater debate about where do we put our resources. And I think, I mean, a defense expert I know made a good point the other day too, which is it's much easier for von der Leyen to say, oh yes, we'll enter this thing by transporting something to Mali or to Central African Republic. Because it's much easier for the German public to say, oh, well, military planes are going somewhere for a good purpose, than to say, we're deploying a unit of paratroopers somewhere. What? You know, German boots on the ground in a dangerous situation? We're not sure about that.
But I would want to say it's not that we would not think we don't want to be embedded or strangled or coming into combat or getting home casualties. It's more than that. First of all, we don't regard the army as a sovereign tool of our foreign policy, and that's the huge difference to France, Britain, and the United States. We would never, if we had got Falkland Islands, we would never have went there on our own.
Constitutionally have a problem. I mean, not a problem, but a situation. It's a Parlamentsarmee. Yes. It's an army that can only be deployed with the specific approval of Parliament.
So, yeah, and then there has always to be an international course regarding a situation or a crisis where we then could say, okay, we want to be part of this international effort, but we would not. There's no national will to say, look, we have to solve this now by military means because there's no other option, and that's very different from other Western countries.
The interesting thing is that this debate is happening at a time when there's the demilitarisation of the armed forces across many of the European countries. The British Armed Forces budget has been totally decimated. They provide only 2 F-16 fighters to the US coalition of the willing against IS. The morale in the armed forces in Britain is very, very low, as it is in France now. The Dutch are cutting back. Why? It's not just the economy. There's a war weariness after Iraq, after Afghanistan, after the botched mission in Libya. And also, much more fundamentally, there's an unspoken debate: is the use of force effective enough? And we have seen this fallout in Afghanistan, especially in Iraq and Libya. And this is a kind of underlying questioning that now the military is asking, not just in Germany, but particularly in Britain and France.
But the question is somewhat moot. I mean, you're not going to negotiate with ISIS here, are you?
You can't. I mean, this is the German dilemma. By the way, it's a dilemma for the United States, yes. That it's a non-state actor. Mm-hmm. And there are more non-state actors now coming into the fore. This is extremely difficult.
Yeah. So let's put it blunt then, Johannes. Is Germany willing, we know, but is it ready to meet its NATO obligations?
Well, yes and no. It is willing to contribute to the fight against the Islamic terrorists. The Germans have been quite quick in deploying weapons and military aid for the Kurdish fighters in the north of Iraq. Syria is a different thing for us. Again, there are constitutional drawbacks and matters to this. The elephant in the room we haven't talked about yet is Vladimir Putin and Russia. And if you ask, are we ready to meet our obligations in the case that NATO is attacked military, I would say no. But this is the Armageddon. I mean, this is bringing the Cold War back and fighting a hot war. Mm-hmm. And then you can ask, there are, on the paper, there are listed 60 or 80 Eurofighters we would have to deploy within 180 days, and we wouldn't match this target at the moment.
Well, what is the consequence then of this report, Alison? It be at the end of the day increase in military spending.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because for the first time in many years, there really is a discussion about increasing military spending. So if that is one of the things that von der Leyen and the government in general wanted to surface, they've succeeded.
Now let's be specific of what we're talking about. Currently, Germany spends 1.3% of its GDP. In numbers, 33 billion euro. NATO target is 2%. Yeah. So Germany falls way short.
Right, as do most other countries. I mean, I think it's 3 countries that are meeting their target. So it's not as if Germany doesn't have plenty of company here, but because it's an important country, yes. And obviously, you know, it means a lot of money.
but Alison and Ali, the 2% of GDP which NATO sets as a benchmark, it's academic, it's woolly, it's what you spend the money on. Right. And as it is, the members of NATO, there's duplication, yeah. There is not enough, there's hardly any sharing and pooling, to use the word. Some tanks, some have models of tanks, others have different models. There's not enough interoperability. A Dutch soldier can't sit in a tank belonging to Germans. So it's not so much the spending volumes, it's what you spend the money on. And if the von der Leyen report actually addresses this might be very good. Plus the economic crisis may finally spur.
Yeah. So if I understand it correctly, yeah. The dilemma then is not really the state of the German Bundeswehr, but the lack of common European security policy?
Now you're getting into 2 things. One of the fundamental weaknesses of the current structure of the European Union, that there isn't, despite the rhetoric, there isn't a common defence policy, because for many reasons, for nationalist reasons, for industry reasons, because the real reason is that it would lead to a European army, and this would underpin the national sovereignty of the individual countries of the EU. And as long as we don't have an integrated defence system, the European Union as the EU is not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, if you look at the larger actors in Europe, the Germans are reluctant for the reasons we have already described. The British wouldn't want to be part of the European army at all. The French would like it, but only if it came from French terms.
Really a French army.
Still, there have to be efforts made just to at least to order the same equipment. And We have tried this several times. The Eurofighter is called Eurofighter because there are many European nations building this thing together. But then, if it comes to the outfitting, every national army said, okay, we want a spoiler on the back, or we want this and that different. That adds to the costs immensely, and we have to get rid of this. So there has at least to be an understanding about the standards, perhaps not about the fighting or targets, but at least about the standards of equipment. That would help.
Isn't it interesting that with the economic crisis, with what's happening in the Middle East, with Ebola, take any number of conflicts now going around the world, isn't it interesting that not one European leader, head of state, head of government, will stand up and say, we have to pool our resources? There seems to be just an enormous reluctance to confront the public with the weaknesses of the armed forces throughout Europe.
Why do you think that is?
Because leaders would have to explain, why do you have armed forces? What is defence for? Why does defence matter? And successive defence ministers and successive leaders are absolutely reluctant to do this. Von der Leyen is touching on it. One of the former defence ministers who got rid of conscription, Karl Theodor zu Gutenberg, he started raising the issue. But the public isn't going to, you're not going to get the public on your side if you don't explain why does defence matter.
And the other question, of course, Alison, is Germany is in a bit of a catch-22, isn't it? Of course, people are saying Germany has to spend more money on military spending in order to fulfill its obligation. Yet, then again, there might be some countries out there that, you know, that could rekindle some old fears, no?
Yes, no, I mean, without question, and which is why Germany always has to tread extra specially carefully. I think it's pretty obvious to any serious observer that there is no sort of horrible jingoistic militarism ringing through this government. But that doesn't mean to say that in general, as with sort of various spectres of the past, and you were the one who mentioned Russia and its aggressive new stance, all sorts of ghosts are kind of out there this year, particularly since it's 100 years since the start of World War I and 75 since the start of World War II. And we'll be getting ready for a very joyous 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it's clouded all by a little doubt. But I think Judy's point is the fundamental one. For awfully long time, there hasn't really been a debate, and it's a very kind of arid debate to have, so it's not the kind of political issue you can go on the hustings and kind of get your voters whipped up about. But it is super serious to understand that you can only be an actor on the world stage if you have two things. You have good diplomacy and you have the sort of the muscle behind that you could deploy if you needed to. But as the world becomes ever more diverse, but everybody's participating in everything because we are a globalized world now, it's going to be increasingly important for governments to define what are they going to use force for and what are they not going to use it for.
And I think that debate is certainly overdue. The popular excuse for German politicians asked about this 2% target is, in fact, that if we were to raise military spending to 2% of our GDP, it would amount to something like 50 billion euros. It would be the biggest defense budget in Europe by far. I mean, at the moment we are, if you just count out what French and British spend on their nuclear deterrence, then the budgets are almost leveled. So the three big nations spending roughly the same amount of money. If we were to increase this by 2/3, maybe other countries wouldn't be that happy. That's one side. On the other hand, in this changed political surroundings, especially the Eastern European NATO members are calling on us and saying, look, are you really taking this NATO thing seriously? Are you going to help us to defend this felt Russian aggression? And we have to back this by really saying, yeah, we do have the means, and we have to invest in this means to be taken seriously.
Well, I wonder about this. I think there's two real tricky questions here. One is coalitions of the willing are replacing NATO. NATO is not involved in IS, and NATO doesn't want. NATO, will give the tacit support to the Baltic states. But we've seen more and more coalitions of the willing coming into play at the expense of a NATO collective solidarity. We saw this in Libya. We were seeing it now in IS, and we've seen it in other missions. Secondly, and I think the Germans are beginning to address this issue, one of the weaknesses of NATO, and the US sees this very well, that the Europeans don't have a shared threat perception. The Poles and the Baltics, Northern Europeans see Russia as their threat. You talk to the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Greeks, Russia, no. The Spaniards, the French, the British would see the Middle East and North Africa as the threat. So when you don't have a common threat perception, it's very, very difficult to decide how you're going to treat defence, what you're going to spend it on, and how you're going to explain to the public what the threats are.
Mm-hmm.
Johannes, do you think these findings are even a blessing in disguise, perhaps? Because it is open up the discussion, and perhaps German citizens will start to take a second look at the military and perhaps change their attitude towards it.
I think at least you could say this report has stirred up quite some interest in Germany, and that means at least the military is taken more seriously now than it has been 5 years ago. So it's up to the politicians now to make something of this and to try to increase public awareness and to find ways to make the society aware of Germany's responsibility, because as the federal president said, we are one of the countries exporting most goods in the world. We are more to rely on outward security than many other countries, and so this is the source of our responsibility.
And Alison, the focus is now on the politicians, says Johannes, and of course the focus is very much on the defense minister, Ursula von der Leyen. You could argue that's the way she likes it. She's, of course, a rather ambitious lady who is even tapped to become a possible successor to Chancellor Merkel. Do you think this is her make or break moment here?
Well, I mean, as I've pointed out about defense ministers in Germany, it's a tricky position. She's in the spotlight. Anybody who's in the spotlight faces more of a make or break moment than somebody who isn't. But I think, you know, she's a very sort of steady person, it seems to me. She works through problems. And her I'm sure the main thing is that she and the Chancellor should be on the same page. She's
attracted some degree of criticism for posing for rather fancy pictures, and people are saying stop.
I really have to say that I think there's an extreme element of chauvinism in this.
Absolutely.
If men do it, it's no problem. If women do it, it's posing for, oh gosh, she's trying to reach women as an audience. Shocking. I mean, I really object.
I agree with this. And Penn is a defence minister visiting the troops, not photographed, frankly. But this is a kind of cynical, cynical aspect. But it's very ambiguous. Some want her, well, she needs her comeuppance. Maybe she'll fail. But this goes back to the role of Chancellor Merkel. Now, it's very, very interesting. If von der Leyen succeeds, Chancellor Merkel can rightly say, see, I chose the right person to run the defence ministry. If von der Leyen fails, well, she tried, But at the end of the day, we had the federal president making a speech, foreign minister making a speech about Germany's responsibility as the defence minister. We're still waiting for Chancellor Merkel.
But we'll wait forever. Because she'll just she'll judge each situation as it comes along.
Certainly you won't know by the end of the show. We only have about 15 minutes left. But Johannes, again, about the attitude of Germans, is it perhaps, do the German people also have to start come out of age? I mean, at the end of the day.
Yes, of course. Judy mentioned, if we scroll back to the 1990s, when it was the first time after the Second World War that German fighter planes went to another country and threw bombs and actually went into combat. That was in Serbia and in the war about Kosovo. The underlying arguments displayed by the then Foreign Minister Fischer was, look, this is the Auschwitz of our days. So you had to reach fairly high to find the support or to find a reason or a cause for doing this. We can't always just start moving when it comes to genocide and really the world is totally into shambles. So we have to maybe come a step down and say, look, this is the situation, this is our possibilities, that's what we have to do. So,
and of course, this is the year where we celebrate 25 years of the wall coming down. And again, it goes back to the question of what Germany is. What kind of country does Germany want to be in the 21st century?
It depends on who you ask, of course. But what is interesting is that the political elites are beginning to now address this question. Before it was public opinion that drove it, and the political elites reacted. But now you're getting a slow change that the political elites, who I mean, they're asking, actually, the world this is the 21st century. It's not just it's interconnected, that the threats are all around us. And we cannot isolate ourselves anymore. And public opinion, yes, we know you don't like war, but frankly, Germany is not unique. Public opinions across Europe don't like war. Most people don't like war. Most people, it's not that the Germans are inherently pacifist because of the Second World War. You can always hide behind this. But I go back to this point, there's a weariness. But the 25th anniversary is a moment. Everything is coming together now. The von der Leyen case, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Russia. The old predictable world order is over. Not that it was ever really predictable, but we're into something new.
And also we're into something where even more than ever these things are interrelated. So IS produces an even greater flood of refugees from Syria. I was interested the other day, you had Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble saying, we will not be able to continue to handle the refugee problem the way it's been handled. We are going to have to spend some money. And for instance, in Africa, we still are at a stage, it would seem to me, where if we help Africans now, we can foster more of a middle class there, even more than the economic growth there is fostering anyway, and people will want to stay. If we don't do it, we should get ready for a big influx of people.
Exactly. And then you have the other elements as well. German or European jihadists going to Syria to fight there, coming back, maybe stirring unrest in our countries. Yes. And I think at the same time, we are no longer that much only defined by the catastrophe of the Second World War as a nation. Other things come into play, and that's quite interesting. Again, there's a task for politicians here to change the outlook a bit. When I was living in Great Britain, my impression was that this country is entirely positive about globalization. They are always thinking they can ride this tiger on their own. That's why they are so skeptic towards the European Union. Whereas the mood in Germany is totally different. We are passive. It's something massive out there. We don't like it. We are unsecure what will happen. A bit more like the French. So we have to change this attitude.
Well, the person that tried to change this was one of the former presidents, Horst Köhler, who was a former head of the International Monetary Fund. And when he was president of Germany, he gave an interview actually explaining that the anti-piracy mission off the coast of Africa, of the Horn of Africa, was there to protect German commercial interests. And how can anybody mention this, that armed forces and German commercial interests have a connection? And what happened? He was forced to resign. Media pressure, the hypocrisy of the media, and now President Gauck can actually say these things openly. Our interests are just not here, they're just not in the Middle East, they're on the commercial sailing channels, trading channels that affect the German economy, that affect the European economy, that affect the world economy. And so finally the debate about defence and security is becoming tangible. It's not about old-fashioned tanks and bombardments. It's about the security of energy supplies. It's about the security of borders. It's about the security of infrastructure. And this is a very good thing that this debate is starting.
No, I mean, security has become... You've got, for instance, the refugee question. I mean, as we celebrate the 25th anniversary, what was 1989, which Judy and I spent so much time together during that year? It was about the movement of people. And now we have people trying to move out of the Middle East and out of Africa because conditions there are frankly unbearable and conditions here are better. And if we really take the message of '89 as this was people striving for a better life, and wir sind das Volk, So why are we not going to listen to this from plenty of other people? In a globalized world, I don't see how we avoid that.
And again, that's the message you can have with regard to Ukraine as well.
Yeah.
And there's a task and responsibility for us, I think.
I mean, Ukraine we've hardly mentioned here, but it's
a security issue, yes.
For Germany, a very big security issue. And at the moment, where the suggestion is that there's still a way to solve this. I haven't heard too much mention of the bill for this.
No, exactly.
Because I don't understand where the money's coming from.
Another bill we would have to fit, and that would be larger than any military equipment we might want to procure. And
indeed, I mean, this finding, we cannot ignore it. Germany cannot ignore it. The politicians certainly cannot ignore it. If you were Ursula von der Leyen's advisor, what would you advise her? What would she have to do to bring the German military back up to shape?
I'm totally content with my role as a bystander, but if I were to advise her, I would say go for European cooperation, but on very, very common standards. Don't do any extras again, and they are tentatively starting this. There have been some agreements on the recent NATO summit. Smaller countries are getting this message quicker than we do. The Dutch and the Danish and others, they are quite eager to cooperate with the larger countries, getting or sharing parts of their armies. I think the Dutch have got rid of all their fighter planes and putting them under Belgian command, whereas the Belgian Navy has been put under Dutch command. So these are models we can pursue.
There's a great penchant in Germany to make a big issue out of something, and then, well, we'll forget about it now. Something else will replace it. I think perhaps von der Leyen herself and her advisors would be well placed not to let this issue disappear. Keep it on the agenda, widen the debate, make it accessible, explain what is happening. This is the time now to, excuse the military term, go on the offensive.
Again, I too am content with my role as a bystander, but I think a combination of these 2 points. Germany has actually an opportunity perhaps to lead, because indeed Britain and France are in a different club. They have a nuclear deterrent and they have a much more robust attitude towards the use of military force, just from evolving from their history and so on. But the new game will definitely be to cooperate more, and Germany could become the umbrella force for that and use its influence and its money to push things forward. I mean, if indeed, even if the percentage went up to, let's say, 1.7% of GDP, there would be several billion more euros available. And perhaps that's the thing to think about. How would we spend those in forging a more common European force?
And since we are running out of time, I do want to get a bit specific here once again, Johannes, about the 2 conflicts that are obviously have kept us occupied for a better part of this year, in the Ukraine and also the fight against ISIS. Let's start with ISIS. Let's start with northern Iraq. The Germans have, after a long debate, agreed to supply Kurds with weapons in northern Iraq. Do you foresee a role beyond that for Germany?
I think there will be a larger role. We probably will not join this airstriking company, but we will do exercising Iraqi troops on the ground, I think.
And what about Ukraine? Let's talk about Ukraine here, because that obviously hits home about Germany's role here. Well, I mean, we know that Chancellor Merkel has been engaging in a very active telephone diplomacy with President Putin. What do you see militarily, Germany?
Militarily, Germany can do very little, and NATO can do very little also. Maybe some training, but Ukraine isn't in NATO and is not going to be a member of NATO in the foreseeable future. Chancellor Merkel is in a terrible bind. I mean, she's the interlocutor with Putin, but we see in front of us happening right now the creation of a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine and a buffer zone being carved out. And whether or not Chancellor Merkel and some of her allies are strong enough to actually prevent this from happening, it's going to be very difficult. And one final point, a frozen conflict means that there's potential instability in Ukraine for such a long time that the idea of pushing through reforms will be very difficult.
So obviously we're not hoping for a military conflict here with Russia.
Certainly not.
But if push comes to shove, Germany's role here?
Well, Germany's role here is going to evolve, and it's going to be still constant engagement. I mean, the only way to keep this issue adaptable is to keep it on the table very, very firmly. So, I mean, and you have to sort of differentiate, I think, between, say, short-term goals. I mean, at the moment, I think the minds are concentrated on the European-Asian meeting next week in Italy, where it's hoped that Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, will meet Putin, the Russian president. You know, that's the talk. We shall see, is that the short-term goal? But clearly, you've got to keep people talking. The difficulty is, as Judy rightly points out, if you have a frozen conflict, you have built-in instability. And basically, Russia has shown, as the rebel forces in the east were on the verge of losing most of their territory at the end of August, Russia weighed in with more help and basically said, we're always willing to put our finger on the scale to make the outcome take us into account. And the question is that going to be so destructive that you really can't do anything? Or is it a way of saying, we've got to be at the table, let's go back a little bit. We can have a long argument about whether Russia was sufficiently informed of Ukraine's willingness to have the association agreement and so on.
Yeah, I think for the long term, there's only hope. There is no proof of a concept working, but in the long term, I think what the European Union is or could be aiming at is to make Ukraine, or the stable part of Ukraine, an economic success, and therefore showing Russia it's on the wrong path. That's the only thing.
But that's hard to do when it's so unstable.
Well, long term, there are no quick fixes here, that's for sure. And I think the same goes for the state of the German military, which have to be reformed in some shape or another. I want to thank my guest for a very insightful talk about European security policy, but also, of course, about the state of the German military as is today. Well, thank you out there for tuning in, and looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.